Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Anti-Media Radio. It's Thursday night, 8 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. I'm your humble, self-loathing host, Jake Anderson, and we're going to talk about a bunch of things today. This is actually going to be a pretty sweet show. I have a friend coming on, a great guest, who is going to talk about some really cool stuff. No, not cool, actually, tragic stuff. But it's going to be a good show. We're going to talk about a bunch of things. We're going to talk about propaganda, the history of the CIA involvement in El Salvador. Always a fun thing to talk about on a Thursday night. Also with us, I got my co-host, DB Schwartz. DB, how you doing tonight?
I'm freaking exhausted, so you're going to have to pardon me if I listen more than I talk.
Yeah, I'm tired too, man. Shit, I'm exhausted. Yeah, what are you tired from? Your work?
Yeah, man, just the hours put in. It's kind of hard and extreme right now, that's all.
Yeah, this wasn't a good day for me either. I went to the Kaiser Pharmacy, and was there yesterday, too, trying to get one medication filled. I'm not going to tell you what medication. Wasn't Vicodin. I wish it had been. But it's just insane how incomprehensible our healthcare system is. I mean, it just seriously drove me to the point of madness today, how much bullshit I had to go through to get a medication filled. And, you know, it got me thinking about what we're always talking about on the show, which is, why is healthcare not a right? You know, in a lot of European countries, I mean, it's like, if we're going to have such opulence and corporate welfare, why would we not at least equip citizens with basic health care and education? I mean, these are just, I just don't understand that. There was only one candidate going for that, Bernie Sanders. I'm not going to talk politics here, but I mean, really, it's getting to the point where they're going to have to do a universal basic income anyway at some point, because automation is going to eradicate like 60% of the jobs. So why wouldn't they just start?
Well, they're planning on a big war, I guess, Jake. That's all I can think.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, well, that would surely cut back on the healthcare costs if everyone's dead. Yeah, it's just a mess. I mean, look.
I mean, why haven't we rebuilt roads or the electrical grid? Because I think they realize at some point it's just going to all get bombed out.
Well, to be fair, Obama was desperately trying to pass an infrastructure bill, but Republicans obstructed the shit out of him every chance they got. And now Trump is going to try and do the same thing and take credit for it. That's just how politics works. But one thing that's going on right now is something that we've got to talk about, and it's what pretty much the theme of the show is going to be, which is there's this new propagandistic push to denigrate Russia. And look, what they did was not cool. No one's arguing that Russia didn't do some shady shit. But let's put it in context. They had about a $200,000 Facebook budget in what was like a $5 billion election. Okay? So if you're looking at this realistically, the Russian trolls, Russian bots, the Russian interference in our democracy, it was about a couple $100,000 and like 13 trolls that infiltrated social media platforms. That is absolutely nothing compared to what our government has done to a litany of countries all across the world. I mean, the list is just absurd.
If you're pissed at somebody, you should be pissed off at Dimitri Baxter.
What?
Your Newswire.
Oh, yeah, well, no, your Newswire sucks, man. That's the thing.
He's like the troll number one.
Like, anyone in the know in terms of alternative media knows who you listen to and who you don't. It's like tabloids back in the day. You don't go, when you're checking out and buying a candy bar, you don't look at the tabloids saying that Obama has an alien baby and say, oh, shit, that's crazy. You know, that's what fake news used to be. For some reason, now that it's online, it's being looked at as this entirely different ilk of news, and it's just absurd. It's just absurd. I mean, the list is absurd. The list of countries for whom the United States has interfered in their elections is far more vast and brutal. I mean, I don't even know where to start. I mean, it's crazy. But, you know, we're going to talk about El Salvador here in a minute, because I really think people should know. I mean, and most people who have studied history to a certain extent knows about what we're talking about here with the CIA fomenting coups and propping up right-wing governments. But a lot of people don't. A lot of people don't know that we've done, you know, basically our entire 20th century was infiltrating governments, funding governments, many of them right-wing governments, and then using that to destabilize those countries. And that was a form of making our democracy look good. I mean, they phrased it as, you know, protecting us in some way. I don't know. I still don't fully understand. My father was in Vietnam, and I tried to have him explain to me what the mentality was exactly of what did the government actually say to get people to want to go to Vietnam. And then I realized it's the exact same thing that they did in Iraq, which is you create an enemy, you drive it home, and then people believe it. And that's what they're doing with Russia here. What I don't understand is we can't go to war with Russia. So the only point of what they're doing now is clearly self-defense. There were so many self-inflicted wounds in the last election that they had to create an enemy to blame that on. So it's not about what we learned about Hillary Clinton and the Democratic Party through the WikiLeaks cables. It's who leaked them. That's what's become more important than the actual content. It's insane. Honduras, Guatemala.
I think we know who leaked him, and I think he died.
Yeah. Well, Seth Rich.
And I think once that comes out, it's going to bring like so many people down that it's going to almost make continuity of government a problem.
Yeah, it could be a big deal.
I mean, why are they putting out all this shit in the news now about how you can fake put people's faces on videos? You think some video's about to come out, or what?
Wait, are you talking about the AI thing?
Yeah, that stupid-ass shit CNN, New York Times, and everyone put out where you can digitally put someone's face on anyone's body so you can make a fake sex tape.
Oh, the deep fakes, yeah.
Right. So, yeah, that's convenient. That's about to come out right when real tapes are.
Yeah. Well, I want to keep us on theme here momentarily. We're going to segue later back into a large issue of propaganda in current day, but I really want people to hear a little bit more about, you know, what's going on and how it's influenced people. So I'm going to introduce our guest, Frank Argueta, and he runs the site West of the Rockies with his wife Genevieve, and I met them both at Contact in the Desert, and it was just really, you know, I really feel like we had a kinship, and he's also helping me with my Elisa Lam documentary, and now he's on the show with us. Frank, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing great, Jake. Thank you for having me on tonight.
Thanks for being here, man. I've wanted to do this for so long, ever since, you know, we spent a lot of time working together on this documentary, the never-ending documentary. And but at getting to know you, I remember at a bar, we were having like a drink after a shoot, and you just told me this just incredible story that just blew my mind. And I've been thinking about it ever since. And I really cannot wait to share it. I mean, it's not a particularly cheerful story, but right. You told me that your family, your father specifically, had basically witnessed firsthand what went on with this coup or whatever you want to call it in El Salvador. So tell us a little bit about like what actually happened from your family's point of view.
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you for the opportunity to share this story. Basically, as you mentioned, yeah, my family is from El Salvador, and El Salvador, you know, for all of the 20th century, had a very tumultuous political climate. What happened in El Salvador is that there is a very huge gap between the top 1 to 2%, and the rest of the poor people. So there is no middle class. This obviously created a lot of issues. In the case of my family, when the Civil War began to ramp up, and we can get into the history as to why that happened. My parents were both teachers, elementary school teachers. And at the time, believe it or not, being a teacher was considered being a rebel, a guerrilla sympathizer, even though the teachers had nothing to do in that regard. The only reason why the teachers were protesting was because they just wanted, the students to have supplies that the schools had the money to provide for the students. And this was a cause that the rebels agreed with, so they kind of lended their support. The government, in their fear of losing control, just grouped these teachers with the guerrilla members. And as I was telling you that night, there were unpleasant stories, but my father had to witness some really terrible things. One of the ones that sticks out in my mind is he recalls one day showing up to school in the morning, just to give his lessons. And as he's walking up to the schoolhouse, and these are not schools like what we have here. You got to think that this is a poor country, and I think they were still made of adobe or something. And as he's walking up, he notices something on the front steps of the school, and as he gets closer, he finds that it's the principal's head on the school's doorstep, with a note in its mouth saying, if the teachers don't stop this, essentially, and I'm paraphrasing, this would be the same fate that they would meet.
Oh my God.
And, you got to think, what kind of government would do this to its own people when all they're trying to do is educate the next generation? And I know we're going to talk about propaganda and all these things, and I think that is the key to fighting propaganda is education. And that's why in El Salvador and many other countries at the time, and, for all I know, still happening today in many places around the world, education is seen as dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
it's why the internet. It's the same reason the internet is also considered dangerous. Information and the truth is considered a threat to the establishment.
Yeah, absolutely. And shortly after that, I was born. I was born in. I hate to date myself here because I'm entering that age where I don't like to think about how old I'm getting. But I was born in 1981. The war really took off in 1979. So in the early 80s, the war was in full swing. One of the, I think the reason why my family had to flee El Salvador was because my father was he went out to get medicine for me. I was born, and a few days after I was born, I became ill or something, and he had to go get medication for me. And back in those days, you couldn't even go out of your house. It was like a total curfew, police, military state, if you will. And he's told this story a few times, and I can tell you this: it never gets any easier for him. He says that, he went out knowing full well the dangers, but, he was, his mentality was like, my newborn is sick. I need to do something about it. So, he left the house and managed to get to the drugstore, to get medication. And on the way back, he says that he was so close to getting home, and he was just walking by this park where the military had set up a checkpoint. And, he was just walking down the sidewalk, and the military was on the opposite end of the street. And, I don't know I don't know if I can cuss here, or, I can always omit. So as he's walking, he just hears somebody say, hey, you stop there, and my dad just kind of kept his head down and kept walking. And he said, hey, you son of a bitch, can't you hear that I'm talking to you? Stop right there. And my dad was, he was like just hoping they weren't talking to him. And he says at that point, he just heard, like the rifle just cock, and they're like, if you don't stop right there, we'll shoot, He has to stop. They search him and handcuff him and put him on the back of a truck. Now, in those days, if this happened to you, it was a death warrant. It was just a death sentence. 95% chance you will not be seen again. So they began to transport him. They don't tell him where they're taking him, and he says that the whole time he's just handcuffed in the back of this vehicle. They take him to what were the headquarters of the military at the time, and he says that they tied him with they tied his thumbs with wire, and his he was kind of like hugging this like metal pole with his thumbs tied, so he couldn't really move. And they kept him there for hours, and he says that no food, no water, and he says that at that point, guards were walking by and kind of just mocking him, and because they thought, anybody that was taken there was under suspicion of being a guerrilla member. So they were calling him all these names as they were walking by him, and he's thinking like, I'm dead. This is it. This is it. Like, they're not going to believe anything I say. And at that moment, he just hears somebody call him, my father's name is Francisco. And he hears somebody just call him like, Don Francisco, is that you? And he looked up, and the soldier, a young soldier that was there, he looks at him, and my dad is like, do I know you? And the guy was like, Don Francisco, it's me, so-and-so. And it turned out to be one of his former students.
Oh, my God.
And he asked him, like, why are you here? Why did they brought you here? You're not messing with any of this. What's happening? And he said, no, I was just buying medicine for my baby, and they stopped me. And the young soldier was just like, he sat down next to him, and he, my dad, I guess in that state, your mind just picks up details, and he remembers this vividly. And he says that the soldier put his rifle, he sat down next to my dad, and he put the rifle between his legs as they were talking. And the other soldiers kept walking by going like, oh, don't be stupid. This guy's going to steal that thing from you and kill us all. They were still, treating him like a guerrilla member. So the young soldier said, let me talk to one of his higher ups. I'm going to clear all this up for you. Don't worry. This young kid goes and talks and manages to convince them to let my dad go. And my dad said, as soon as I got home, he grabbed my mom, grabbed my older brother, who was 8 or 9 at the time, and myself, and he began to make preparations for us to get out of there, because he knew that somebody was watching over him at that moment. And it was kind of like a clear sign that it was now or never.
Man, wow, that's those are incredible stories. Wow, and so I mean, there's, a few years ago, Obama actually apologized formally for what happened in Argentina, but there's been very little recognition about what happened in El Salvador, and there's a pretty good article about this for people who want to know more in The Nation. But essentially, the CIA, the U.S. CIA, was basically propping up a right-wing government in order against Marxist guerrillas. I mean, obviously, but what he was saying was that everyone who was basically called a guerrilla, or anyone could have been called a guerrilla, not necessarily whether they were Marxists or not. But that dirty war fomented by the CIA cost 75,000 lives. Now, fortunately, Francisco was not one of them. And, both my parents were teachers in Arkansas, which is a little bit safer than El Salvador was at that time. But I have a great respect for teachers, and it's really interesting to think that teachers were considered such agitators at the time. And so let's get into a little bit about what you know about. I mean, anyone can read historical texts about the role of the United States CIA in these other countries, but from what your father has told you and from what you know personally, what do you know about what was going on in terms of the involvement of the U.S. interfering in the El Salvadoran country at that time?
I think El Salvador is somewhat of a cautionary tale when you step back and see it as a whole, and I'll try to move along as quickly as possible to make sure I cover everything. But I have to go back to the early 20th century, and I believe it was around 1929 is when there was the first uprising against what was called Las 14, or the 14, which is what the 14 richest families of El Salvador were referred to as. These 14 families control every aspect of El Salvador, from the work of the fields. El Salvador used to have a very rich and thriving coffee industry. From what I hear, it was some of the best coffee in the world. And these families basically had a monopoly on that country. And what I mean by that is that not only did they own the land, but they would employ the poor peasant people to work the fields, and then they wouldn't even pay them with money. They would pay them with a voucher that could only be redeemed in certain stores that were owned by, surprise, surprise, one of the 14 families, right? So they definitely had the economy and the government in lockdown. The peasants began to organize, and there was an uprising in 1929, I believe, or early 1930s. So I have to double check. I apologize. Led by Farabundo Martí. This uprising was pretty much, killed everyone in 10 days. The government, by sheer brute force and murder, really killed unarmed peasants. The peasants only had machetes, and here comes the army with guns, right? After that, throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, right up until the 70s, not a lot had changed in El Salvador. You had that huge gap between the super wealthy, which were just made up about 2% of the population, and everybody else. That's when the second uprising began. Now, it was actually a number of groups that joined together under one banner, which became El Frente Farabundo Martí para la Liberación Nacional, which is Front Farabundo Martí, named after the original, individual that tried to rise against these people. The National Liberation Front. That is the name, and they are currently the government in power in El Salvador now. But at the time, they were just a guerrilla group, and they began to arm themselves in order to fight for the poor people that were being exploited. Once the government and the people in power realized that this is what was happening, they pretty much did a coup to remove the president at the time and then implement a more military structure to the government. Now, once this took place, this was still during the Carter administration. Carter seemed to have been okay with it. Enter Reagan, and that's when things really ramped up. Reagan, our current president has referred to El Salvador as a shithole country. Reagan had a little bit more decorum and called it his backyard. But that's just the way they saw Central America, right?
Reagan was a little bit more polite than someone. That's crazy.
Right. That's why he's the great communicator, Jake. Come on, we all know this. But that's when you began to see the first signs of U.S. involvement in El Salvador. And at first, it began with supplies. Because obviously, in the 50s, we had McCarthyism, right? Like the big Red Scare. And that carried well into the 70s and the 80s. So they saw this as a threat. Nicaragua was already, going red a bit. Guatemala, there were rumors of an uprising, and El Salvador was was just starting in full swing. So the U.S. saw this as they had to help squash this guerrilla movement. So they began to send just supplies. Then they began to send weapons. And then they began to send personnel to train soldiers. Now, the reason why the U.S. will never, in my opinion, claim responsibility for this, because you got to think, the moment the U.S. claims responsibility for this, a lot of people would have, if the U.S. would have said, look, you know what, we backed the wrong guy, we're sorry, we know we caused a lot of problems, then every Salvadorian would have been eligible for asylum. And what does that mean? It's like they would have gotten the same treatment that the Cubans get when they get to Florida, right? They would have gotten a year of English classes and a lot of benefits to integrate to society as an asylum candidate. But the reason why they can't do that is because they did so many things underhandedly in El Salvador that the admittance of that would just be, a black eye in the face of the CIA. And what I mean by that is that they are responsible for training troops in El Salvador, and training and providing assistance to a man by the last name of Dahuizon, who was the guy who established what became known as Los Escuadrones de la Muerte, or the Death Squads. Right. The Death Squads were the guys that would come to a village in the middle of the night, and this happened. There were at least 2 massacres, and the U.S. tried to downplay the number of deaths in these 2 massacres. They would go into a village, round up the people in the middle of the night in the center of the village, and began to ask who was a guerrilla member or who had a family member in the guerrilla member. If they found anybody, they would be executed in front of everybody else. And they would be told this is what happens to anybody that helps the guerrillas. Now, in the case of these 2 massacres, these soldiers that, by now the U.S., as I mentioned, was being supported by the U.S., the military sent these soldiers into these villages, and at least in the case of of one of the massacres, and I'll see if I can find the name of the town that it happened. The soldiers went in, rounded up everybody, separated the man from the women and the children. The men were all executed. All the women were raped and then executed, and young girls as young as 12 were also raped and executed by the military, backed by the U.S., with CIA U.S. military training. And it was known that, as the stories came out, that the soldiers were even bragging that, the 12-year-old girls were the best.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
So...
that's our government, people. That's who the United States is, and that's happened in so many other countries. Even just recently, Libya, Syria, Yemen. I mean, this is who we.
Don't forget, that's who the UN is, because look at Haiti.
Right. Absolutely, yeah. All right, sorry. Go ahead. Keep going, Frank, please.
Yeah, it's El Mesote. If anybody wants to look that up, the El Mesote massacre, MOZOTE. Just because I know it might sound a bit unbelievable, but luckily in the age of information that we live in, you can type a few words and find out a lot about this stuff. Now, I saw something funny. Well, not funny. I mean, this is good news, really. It just came out the other day that Archbishop Oscar Romero who was a Salvadorian archbishop. Sorry to sound redundant. He was one of the biggest advocates for the poor during the war. And there's a movie that starring Raul Julia called Romero, based on his life. I think this movie's from the 80s. And if anybody watches that movie, just so they know, it's about 70% accurate. And what I mean by that is that it was actually way worse than what they portray in the movie. I think they literally had to dial it back just for audiences, some of the more gruesome details of the war in El Salvador. But Archbishop Romero, he is about to become a saint after many, many years. This man, as I say, he championed for the poor, and because of that, he was considered a threat by the military. And it was a CIA-trained sniper that killed Archbishop Romero as he was initiating Mass in El Salvador in front of his congregation. Now, this was a huge, huge deal because this was a clergyman that had no political ties. All he was doing was fighting for the poor. But the poor were the enemies of the state. I mean, is this twisted or what, right?
Yeah.
Now, when he was killed, obviously this ramped up the war. It just took it to another level. His funeral, which was attended by thousands of people in the town square, and actually my parents were there. People were there to mourn the death. And I mean, if you look at photos of this thing, it's just people as far as the eye can see. And if you can believe this, Jake, the military sent people ahead of time. And this MO is going to sound very familiar to folks that keep up with this type of stuff. They had planted detonation devices around the town square, and they had shooters on top of, I can't remember what the government building was. I think it was a library or some type of like the city hall, I think, which was across the street from the church. And as the people were mourning the death of Archbishop Romero, they opened fire on the crowd. From an elevated position, they opened fire and began to detonate their devices to corral people in one specific direction. Now, my dad, who was there, he says that if he had not been standing where he was standing, which was in an area where they could like exit the square, he says that he probably would have been killed then and there because there were many, many people dead that day. And here we have a government opening fire. It wasn't a political demonstration at all. It was a funeral. And it was a funeral of a beloved, someone that the people loved very much, somebody that was looking out for them, probably like one of the few people that cared. You got to remember, the Catholic Church didn't want anything to do with it. John Paul II, Monsignor Romero asked them at least on one occasion to come to El Salvador and help, calm things. And he wouldn't do it. So it was such a traumatizing thing to happen at a national level. And the effects of this war, I mean, people are still living them today. When in the mid 2000s, I was working as a freelance interpreter at the asylum office for the immigration service here in the U.S. And I had to translate testimony from people that had left the war. And Jake, there were days when I would come home and want to cry for hours. Mm-hmm. Because these were the most humble people that, they were too poor to go to school to read or write, but they have these stories of having their husband killed in front of them, or having their kid, hacked into pieces, or, just very horrible things. And the fact that the U.S. would back a government that they knew full well was carrying out these atrocities, it just blows my mind, And I know that there's a big and look, I'm not a communist or a socialist. I think all those things sound great on paper, but the one thing that will stop these systems from working is just the human condition. We're just too greedy. Like, it'll never work. So I'm not trying to sit here and get on a soapbox and preach politically. But what I'm trying to say is, these were poor people, and all they wanted was a fair wage, a livable wage. They didn't want to be treated as slaves. And the U.S. government chose to back a fascist dictatorship. That's what it became, that wanted to maintain this lower class and just use them as cheap labor.
And that's happened, in countless other places. I mean, that's the MO of the United States foreign policy for years. That's just incredible. I mean, thank you so much, Frank. I mean, you just literally, listeners literally just got a clinic in a people's history from you. Just incredible, and heartbreaking. But these are the kind of things that we have to talk about, and people have to be aware of what is actually going on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you tell me, just because I don't know a lot about El Salvador, can you tell me how MS-13 plays into all this?
That is a great question, actually. When the exodus, if you will, of refugees from El Salvador began, a lot of people, I know of people that went as far as Australia. Most people went to the countries around El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala. It's, obviously, it's not like people had the money and the resources to catch a plane out of the country. A lot of people stopped in Mexico on their way out of El Salvador, and some people, managed to make it to the U.S. When they arrived in the U.S., many of them settled in L.A. Los Angeles is, we have a big concentration of immigrants here in L.A. And when they arrived here, you got to remember what was happening in L.A. and across the country in the 80s, right? We had Reagan as a president. Reaganomics were in full swing. And the crack epidemic was happening, right? Now, this was just the prime ground for, a lot of gang activity. At least in LA, I'm familiar with, obviously, the Blood and the Crips and, their struggle for territory. So when all of these immigrants came to the U.S., a lot of them, this is just a reality of it and not a pleasant one, but a lot of them were harassed and assaulted by members from these gangs. What I hate, it wasn't the greatest idea, but what was a group of people to do but join together, right? And they started their own gang. And this gang, I mean, if you ask me how they got to be this powerful, I couldn't even tell you because it blows my mind. But it basically began as a way of, these refugees to kind of not be harassed or taken advantage of by these other gangs. And, unfortunately, I wish El Salvador was known for something more than violence, but let's see what bred that violence. I don't think people are violent by nature. I think the environment makes them violent. And when you have governments that create this environment for their people, how else do you expect them to respond?
Wow. Yeah. Oh, man. That is nuts. I hadn't even thought about that angle of it. So we don't have a lot of time left. Originally, I was going to have you on until 8:45. Hopefully, can you hang around till 9?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. As long as you guys want me, I'm here.
Great, man. Because I really want to get into like how you transitioned into what you're currently doing. And so, first of all, I'd like to know exactly, when you came to Los Angeles, how those experiences were, in El Salvador were formative for you personally, and then how that got you to want to get into the field of alternative news and what you're currently doing now in Los Angeles? Because I do think it's a tenuous connection, but I feel like there is a connection there in terms of you wanting to establish a counter narrative to what's going on.
And you know what? I've thought about this over the years. As you get older, I guess you kind of look back at your life and see how certain things steered you in certain directions, right? I came to the U.S. at a very early age. I grew up, as many immigrant kids, speaking Spanish at home and English at school, and it was definitely growing up in LA was very interesting. I was subject, as many people, I was subject to, racism and racist comments. People would say some pretty awful things and horrible things. Even teachers at my school, I was just telling my wife Genevieve a story I remember earlier today about, taking ESL classes, right? Like English as a second language classes in school. And we had this teacher, and she was just a very bitter lady. And she would always kind of talk down to the students. And, a lot of these kids don't speak very good English, right? And I remember one day she, I guess, lost her patience or something. And she began to say, oh, you kids can't just come to school for the free food and just, not expect to do any work and this and this and that. And I was like, what? I could understand that much, So I definitely, growing up in LA, I got to experience, different facets of life here. And that really shaped my personality in a way that, I told myself I don't want to be one of those people that judges based on where they're from or what they do, or how they speak or how they look. And after that, as I said, I got older, and, a lot of these stories came to light with, my father and, my parents' history in El Salvador. And I began to realize that, a lot more happens than what you're told. And that just made me very uneasy as a child. It's like, well, there's obviously a truth in the middle of all this, right? And that's around. And look, my dad has always also been an avid, armchair researcher, if you will, of everything from like occulted history to, secret government UFO type stuff, right? Which is kind of where I got it from, I guess.
Yeah, me and you both, man. We love history and political stuff, but there's that side of us that just loves to talk about UFOs and paranormal stuff. There's some connections there, I guess, if you look hard enough. But anyway. So that kind of set me on this a path of wanting to learn more and learn about the stuff that happens behind the scenes. And even to this day, I do, audio video production type work and stuff. And even to this day, I just love behind the scenes work. I like to see how things are run, and that applies to, I guess, the truth, if you will, and that just kind of said, I have to say that my father was probably my biggest influence. Just seeing what he went through. Really, both my parents. I know I'm speaking predominantly about my dad in this case, but my mom. Quick story, if you guys want a morbid little story. When I was younger, about 5-6 years old, I used to have these recurring dreams where I was in this big room and all the lights were off except for a single spotlight in the center of the room, and I would walk into the center under this spotlight, and all of a sudden I began to look into the darkness, and I would see people walking towards me, and they kind of looked like zombies, their clothes were tattered, but they they were decomposing, but they weren't mindless zombies. They looked like they still had awareness in their eyes. And I remember they would walk closer and closer, they would get close, but never close enough to touch me. And I remember I would close my eyes and I could still see these faces. And I remember finally, as a young kid, I just told my mom about this dream because it kept happening. And years later, at the time, she just kind of tried to calm me down. And years later, she told me that when I told her about those dreams, she thinks that it was because when she was pregnant with me,
she had to see a lot of dead bodies laying on the streets. The soldiers would come and kill people, and they wouldn't even take the bodies away. They just leave them there, and I think one of the things that she remembers the most was being on a bus, and there was this one bridge that would just go, and join these two towns together. And she says that one day she was on the bus taking this bridge, and she was pregnant, and they had bodies sitting on the bridge, on the side of the bridge. There were bodies sitting there with their heads between their legs, and just this huge banner, saying that any rebels, that would be their fate. And I remember thinking, like, I could see that happening, like that kind of affecting an unborn child,
Right. Well, there's all kinds of evidence coming out, like real scientific studies showing that trauma is passed along, like phobias of your mother or even grandmother can be passed along to you, which is an incredible.
Can I also add into that, when the environment's really, really rough outside, that they've correlated that with being overweight later in life because the body doesn't want to give up any calories so it can survive.
Oh, wow.
Interesting.
That's really interesting.
So the people on the bridge, when you say their heads were between their legs, do you mean that quite literally? Like
literally, they were decapitated, and they would place the head between the legs of the corpse. I mean, it was terrorism, and this is the government. They were saying that the guerrilla were terrorists, and when I look at history, the Salvadorian history, I see that what they called guerrillas and terrorists were the people that all they wanted was the poor people to not be treated like animals. There was a time, and I think it was like the ambassador to El Salvador from the U.S. that wrote a letter back to Carter or Reagan, I can't remember, that said that the farm animals had more value than people in El Salvador.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of tells you, a little bit of how lives and humanity, if you will, was seen at that time.
It's crazy. Well, okay, so a lot of stories here and a lot of very morbid history, and I think we've established. I mean, people can do their own research on the involvement of our government in funding these various horrible wars that have had these horrible effects. And
could I ask what Frank, what do you think is El Salvador's future?
Right now, El Salvador, as I mentioned, the FMLN, which is they used to be the guerrillas, now they became the left, the political party. And they're in power at the moment. They're trying to basically here's the situation. Arena, which is the right wing party, and they had been in power through most of the 20th century. And the Arena is the they're it's made up of some of the 14 families and those people. And they, as I said, had control of the country for most of the 20th century. Now that the FMLN is in power, they still hold majority. So what happened was that the peace treaty was signed in 1992 in Mexico City. In that peace treaty, a lot of things were laid out. Things from like, the rights of every citizen to have, a livable wage, the right to go to school and, basic human rights. Like, we're not talking anything beyond, just trying to make life livable for the poor people. And the right-wing government, even though they stayed in power after the peace treaty, did very little to implement all of these, things that they had agreed upon when they signed the peace accord. Now, what the FMLN is trying to do is try to get these agreements or these resolutions in effect But because the right-wing government still holds majority, it's kind of like an uphill battle. And we can only hope that, future generations can make a difference. I mean, it's such a small country, but, I haven't had the chance to go back for, a number of reasons. One of them mainly is I really don't have family over there anymore. But, it's, from what I hear, it's a beautiful country. Surfers love it. Apparently the beaches are great. And it's been called the place of the eternal summer. So it's a beautiful country that unfortunately has been bathed in blood, and human greed and corruption have just, driven it so far into the ground.
It sounds like if ever the people could take it back, it would be like a little mini Costa Rica.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Frank, what do you think about the current state of, I guess the larger term would be the mental environment, but in terms of propaganda and disinformation and the need for the power establishment to create, a kind of manufactured consensus on our current history and our past history. What do you think is going on? Like, I know that you've written some things about even things is out there as mind control and whatnot. But in terms of what's in front of us, I mean, the use of propaganda by the government was only recently legalized in 2012. Obama tucked it into the NDAA and made it actually legal for the government to use propaganda against American citizens. What are your thoughts on kind of what's going on in terms of shaping the public opinion about these things? And that includes excluding history, excluding the people's history of what's gone on in these places. But, what do you think about that?
I think that, as the I forget what was the name of the person that said this, but it's the best of times and it's the worst of times right now for what you're talking about here. Because on the one hand, we are living in the age of information where we literally are walking around with a piece of plastic that gives us access to the world. The problem is that all of that is becoming centralized, and that is a very, very big danger. Yeah. Propaganda has always been there. I mean, your history book is a propaganda. Okay, what is it? The victors write the history books. Like, I was just flipping through one of the books here the other day and preparing for this interview, and this book was written from the point of view of the right. And this book is freely available in El Salvador everywhere. And it's kind of like the history of El Salvador from the right's point of view. So I feel like this is not exclusive to El Salvador. I think we are constantly surrounded by propaganda. The only cure, as I said at the beginning, is just we need to be better informed. And, we need to have our bullshit detectors on high alert at all times, because right now, people's opinion are the new currency. And they know this. They know the power of that. And just like they were persecuting teachers in El Salvador because they knew that education was going to plant the seeds for these kids to say, hey, this is not right, or hey, that things shouldn't be that way. That is really the best way to combat this. I mean, I watch the news, man, and in our current political climate, it's just you're getting hit by propaganda from both sides, and I think you should listen to both sides. But in the middle of those two sides lies the truth, and unfortunately, I think that the truth is very uncomfortable for a lot of people. So they rather, it's like baby birds. They just want somebody to kind of take the news for them, chew it up, and spit it into their mouths just to digest. And we can't let ourselves fall into that. If the press, if the government, if any of these people want to control what you see and what you read, you got to ask yourself, why is that happening? What are they trying to, why are they dangling this carrot in front of me? What is it that they're trying to hide? Because that is the story of El Salvador. They were hiding under the guise of, oh, this is communism and terrorism, but they didn't tell you the real story that, hey, poor people are being killed and massacred by the rich few.
A familiar story.
Absolutely.
Well, just incredible information, and I really appreciate you putting the time in to prepare for the interview. I mean, just incredible information, and I'm going to go ahead and let you go now. We'll talk more off air, and I'll see you when I'm down in Los Angeles, Frank.
For sure.
But thank you so much. So everyone should check out Frank's and his wife's website, West of the Rockies, and he also does an incredible radio show that I've been a guest on, and it's fun stuff. So check out West of the Rockies. And Frank, thank you so much, man. And
no, I really appreciate the chance to share this story, and I hope more people out there look into this because, like I said, it's a cautionary tale, and the times that we live in, we need to be alert.
Absolutely. Oh man! All right, thank you so much, Frank. Take care, man. We'll talk soon.
For sure. Bye-bye.
DB, what do you think about that, man? Some good stuff, huh?
Well, I just don't know much about it, and I think everybody kind of learned that the story of El Salvador is a story that's been played time and time again, especially in Latin America and Central America, and it's sad, man. There's so much potential down there, everywhere, all over. There's natural resources, there's wonderful people, and overwhelmingly shitty governments, and isn't that the story worldwide?
Yeah, man, he really touched on a lot of big points. But man, some of those stories are haunting, and to think
it's a country that sounds like it's had like 80 or 90 years of being in a world war with itself.
Oh, that's it for us tonight, everyone. Thanks for listening, and do your research on history.
This is live through the stereo. Go and let it blow through the stereo. I'ma let them know through the stereo. Yo, here we go through the stereo. This is live through the stereo. Go and let it blow through the stereo. I'ma let them know through the stereo. Yo, here we go through the stereo.